Welcome to the CitiesR4Living Podcast, an official podcast of the International Project Management Association. Join hosts Dr. Beverly Pasian from the Netherlands and Peter Ahmad from South Africa as they explore this world of smart and livable cities. Through the stories and perspectives shared by project managers across the globe, each episode seeks to offer valuable insights, practical advice, and engaging discussions on the latest best practices in the project management field. The CitiesR4Living podcast is for project managers, built environment professionals, and community groups interested in expanding a community of practice, maximizing the impacts of projects across the globe, and enhancing the quality of life for all citizens. So it's the 19th of April 2025. Peter Ahmad here in Cape Town on the IPMA, the International Project Management Association's CitiesR4Living podcast. A brand new initiative, and I'm absolutely delighted to have across the water, many thousands of kilometers away to the north in the Netherlands, Beverly Pasian. Bev, how are you keeping? Are you in good form? Where do we find you in the Netherlands today?
Hey, Peter. I'm in Utrecht, which is about 30 minutes outside of Amsterdam. I think the best city in the Netherlands. It's the place I've called home for almost 15 years.
The accent certainly betrays an initiative. Maybe you have the Netherlands residency now. I don't know. But tell me a bit about the origin story of Beverly, because it sounds like it's from a different continent.
Yeah, well, I am Canadian. And what's funny about my accent is that I have had many people, a surprising number, ask me if I was British. I really don't know where that comes from. When I lived in Australia, I lived in Sydney for about 2.5 years. And my Aussie friends had the good sense of asking me, which part of North America was I from? Because their hearing of the English language is so finely calibrated that they could make a distinction between speaking like a Canadian and speaking like an American. But for some reason, I get a lot of, are you British here in the Netherlands? But yeah, I moved here almost 15 years ago. My international sort of orientation comes largely from school and my professional life. Starting in Canada, I ended up doing various degrees, one in the UK, one in Australia, one in France, and now in the Netherlands. So I don't know if you want to hear about my professional background now or later, but those experiences have certainly influenced my accent.
Well, I'm sure we're going to get into some of the research that you did as part of those studies, as part of the ways that we're thinking about trying to structure this series going forward. But do tell us a bit about the IPMA, this International Project Management Association, your role within that. And I guess the big question that anybody listening to this as the, let's call it pilot episode, will be saying, well, what's the IPMA trying to get out of a podcast as a vehicle for what?
My involvement with IPMA started many, many years ago, almost 20 years ago. Back in Canada, I was the founding president of the Canadian membership within IPMA. And that relationship continued in different roles. When I approached Ben Peters as an interview subject for my research, it was a tremendous conversation that revealed many themes that we will revisit in this podcast. At the time, he was the chair of the special interest group focused on smart cities. That has since evolved into a special interest group called Smarter Urban Rural. When I was finishing my last research project, I approached him and I said, look, IPMA doesn't have a podcast yet. And the telling of city-based stories naturally lends itself to a podcast series. I have a research framework that could help tell those stories. He was immediately happy with this idea, and we'll talk further about that in a future episode. The storytelling of cities is a valuable approach because project managers are citizens at the beginning of the day and at the end of the day. If we can, through this podcast, influence project managers by reminding that citizenship comes first, then we will have done a good day's work.
So I guess the whole question of this idea of livability, of quality of life, of improving the lives for not just the citizens, but the visitors, the businesses, that holistic approach rather is fundamental to this idea, and trying to get the stories that people you've met with, members of the IPMA, other professional groups who might be supporting these initiatives, start to tell their stories, and then we build a bit of a body of knowledge. Is that a fair summary?
That's absolutely fair. I think that what we will find in these conversations are observations based on real world experiences, real world data, actual practices, actual projects, potential projects. But what I think we'll also find are the topics that actually speak to larger issues that haven't yet been captured in research projects or approved projects or anticipated plans or strategies for the year 2040. These smaller topics that have big impact that I want to really bring the attention to. Let me give you an example. When I was doing my case study research, I ended up looking at 8 cities. At the same time, I was gathering hundreds and hundreds of project details from cities around the world. I've ended up generating a collection of about 5,000 project descriptions. And I started looking at this data and realized that questions of gender didn't surface in these project details. And so that led me to adjust my questions to the interview subjects. And most significantly and directly, I said, this is a very interesting project, but have you considered it from a woman's point of view or from a different gender's point of view? And surprisingly and somewhat disappointingly, every one of my interview subjects said no. And so it's very helpful, of course, to see that there is an enormous investment in smart city projects on transportation infrastructure, for example. But I think it's equally revealing that next to no attention is being paid to the gender relevance of these same projects.
What I found really interesting in the first episode that we'll be releasing shortly on the back of this pilot was the discussions from Calgary City in your home country, Canada, talking about things like digital literacy and how do you reach particularly minority groups who might not have the tech? How do you make them? So we can talk about smart cities and grand designs, big data, all that good stuff, which of course is the sexy stuff and the stuff that makes the headlines. But really a lot of that conversation was around trying to plug in to the blind spots. And I thought that was particularly revealing. From a South African perspective, we often are getting stuck on these amazing artist impressions of future cities. And I'm like, there is so much more we need to plug it into the realities of 2025 South Africa, which is really diverse. And I think that's what you're describing there, the blind spots.
It's a good choice of words. And 2 things come to mind. One is the theme that I raised in the interview with Erin that connected her to the notions of digital equity is the theme of social justice. And that attention to the less enabled, those who don't have access to tech as you and I do. There are a growing number of smart city projects devoted to social justice issues, but Calgary is particularly progressive in that way. The city-based experience of Calgary will shed a light on specific ideas and specific issues that speak to social justice. Your remark about South Africa reminded me of the conversations I've had with Ben, and that South Africa represents, and let me preface my remarks by saying I've never been to South Africa. I really can't speak with any authority on it. But I do remember what I was told in those interviews, and that is a city can be the most innovative, the most tech-intensive, the most progressive, projectized place around. But if it's struggling with legacy issues, as in Johannesburg and Cape Town, it's next to impossible to achieve any future goals because you're understandably still trying to overcome those legacy issues. So I think through this podcast, by having conversations with city representatives from around the world who can speak to both progress and legacy management, will bring a lot to our listeners.
In summary, it's a lot more than what I would imagine the basics of project management, bring the project in on time, within budget, and fit for purpose. It's taking it to a couple of different dimensions, which from your research, you found were often being overlooked. And we've used that phrase blind spot. So it's the basics of project management with the additional lenses that we're thinking about. In our discussions, Beverly, we've been talking about how we can use some 12 themes to structure some of our conversations. It's not going to be an exact science, but there's sort of 12 pillars or themes that you considered within your research, which we thought might be useful around framing some of the conversations which are to come. Perhaps you want to tell us about 2 or 3 of those.
Sure. There are 12, and you can see them presented in my book, A City's Heartbeat. The PDF of that will be in the links below. Just quickly listing them: safety, housing, health, work is actually work and economic value, education, transportation, environment, spirituality, beauty, leisure, social justice, and culture. Obviously, I can tell stories about each and every one of them, and the podcast episodes will do just that. A couple that I'd like to highlight, a few that really surprised me. One was the lack of attention toward housing. The project collection I have is based on about 4,500 projects from around the world and 8 cities. The lack of attention toward housing projects is really disturbing given the needs in different parts of the world for affordable housing. A few surprising ones, but not surprising when you think about it. Safety was unexpected to me in the frequency of projects that emerged. That safety theme reflects everything from environmental warning systems to enhanced police presence in cities. It tells a very interesting story, that particular theme. A couple that I would like to spend as much time on as possible are the ones that I call exciters in my research. The exciters are spirituality, beauty, leisure, social justice, and culture. Those are the ones that I consider the goal of quality of life in cities. Those are the ones that we all aim for, those dimensions of city life that really give us quality. And when I look at the distribution of these projects, the differences per city that you can really see amongst these 5 in particular. Calgary has a lot of social justice projects, and Aaron talks about those in the episode. Australia has a lot of leisure and beautification projects. Having lived there and trying to avoid going too far down any generalizations or stereotypes, the increased number of beauty and culture and leisure projects in Australia didn't surprise me too much. The one that I found particularly interesting was the spirituality theme, or the projects that allowed a city to engage in faith-based communities. I go to Catholic churches here in Utrecht, and my remarks aren't based on religious or spiritual interests at all. My remarks are based on fundamental principles of stakeholder management. And what do I mean by that? One night I was coming home, and I was very much thinking of my research, and it occurred to me the prediction that is often floated around, that 2/3 of the world's population or more are going to be living in cities by the year 2050. It occurred to me that, right, of those billions of people by 2050 arrive in cities, I imagine some of them are going to want to go to church or to a mosque or to a synagogue or what have you. And I was lying in bed one night and I started Googling land ownership. it surprised me very much to find out that the Roman Catholic Church is the largest non-governmental landowner on the planet. And this isn't some sort of, blogger in the middle of wherever making this claim. This is the University of Notre Dame. And so it dawned on me, if the biggest landowner in the country, in some cases, or very specifically in some cities, isn't at the table when talking about smart city projects, then somewhere along the line, we've made a mistake. And by we, I mean project managers. The 4,500 projects that I gathered have 6 focused on faith-based community efforts. Of those 6, many of them have to do with cemetery management. It's a good example of a project area that needs a lot more attention. And it's my wish that this podcast series do just that. The episodes will be co-hosted by the two of us. One of the reasons I'm very excited about that is your own background in being a built environment professional. I'd like to hear more about that. And I'd like our listeners to be as excited to listen to you as I am to work with you.
Well, Bev, thanks very much. And I'll try and keep it brief. I always describe myself as by trade, a town planner, studied in the UK, in Manchester. My accent probably betrays, yes, I've been here for 30 years living in South Africa, but originally from the UK, schooled in the UK, and I say graduate from the University of Manchester's planning school. Came here in 94, obviously a pivotal year for South Africa in terms of its democratization, and started to work in the public sector in 1996 up in Johannesburg. And I've worked in the public sector right up until April of 2022. So I think that was 27 years of unbroken service, working for the public sector, working for government in the new South Africa, with all of the challenges it has. And you've mentioned housing, you've mentioned inclusivity, and obviously the historical legacy South Africa is dealing with of decades of fragmentation and race-based planning, which we're now trying to play catch up on. I've always been interested in the storytelling medium, of being able to hook into the network of people that I've worked in association with, whether it was within South Africa, and particularly during that COVID period, across the world, when we sort of you can talk about globalization in many different ways, but I've certainly got a sense that allowed people to connect in at least the online way far more effectively than we'd done before on the global network. And I'd been curating my own podcast, the Talking Transformation podcast, since 2019. I think it was July 2019. I started to put together a podcast which was really looking at South African cities and the challenges they faced, and listening to community groups or built environment professionals, planners by trade, or whoever, telling us what they're doing, how are they going about their business, and putting that down as an archive of material that people can dip into. And I've worked with Ben Peters back in the day at City of Cape Town. We've worked for many years together. When this opportunity came up to work with the IPMA and work with yourself, it's obviously a real great opportunity to pivot and to build that conversation broader, and on the global perspective as well as within a different professional discipline. But I think we've said from the start, this is not about just project managers as a profession. No. It is under the IPMA umbrella, but make no mistake, it's about trying to reach out to all professionals, all community groups who are engaging on this, to tell their story. And I think that's what's exciting going forward.
Thank you. And it is that built environment perspective that will make our conversations meaningful to the variety of stakeholders who can influence these projects. What does success look like for you with this podcast?
Great question, Bev. I think the idea, I've always had fairly limited aspirations in terms of numbers. I don't think it's about numbers of people who listen. That's something that you build over time and based on the momentum and the quality of the conversation and the production that goes with that. So what we'll be aiming for is high quality guests to come and tell us their stories, and that over a period of time, success to me would look like an archive of material that IPMA members and beyond are able to tap into, whether it's in 5 years time or 5 months time or 5 weeks time, And to be able to say there's a barometer of where a particular project manager or built environment or community group was at that point in 2025, 26 as we go forward.
Yeah.
And how does that resonate today? And what's the lesson I can take? And, I think so often we hear about sometimes you need to fail in order to step
Progress,
forward.
yeah.
And what better way than through a storytelling narrative, to listen to people's successes and failures, to keep it upbeat, but at least to hear that sometimes unintended consequences or these things that are, again, I've used blind spots already today.
Yeah.
And to say that there's a network of people and a network of conversations that are being recorded, curated and archived. And that to me would be a success, not just in terms of the IPMA, but in terms of this whole using podcasting for what it's there, which is that we're not professional broadcasters. That's not our trade. We have other daily interests. But in the meantime, we're using our skills, our network, and our lessons learned to try and bring a degree of
awareness,
competency and awareness within that space. So that's long-winded to say, we want a great podcast. We want to have fun. We want to invite people into this space and to invite them onto the show if they have stories they want to tell. The idea of maybe putting people around a virtual round table to record a bit of a panel discussion at some stage. But for now, Beverly, I wanted to say thank you so much for taking time out of your Easter weekend. And I do hope you and Murphy, your companion in chief, have a great day. It's hopefully a beautiful day there in Utrecht. Beautiful Utrecht. I had the pleasure of visiting there about 2 years ago. Stunning city.
Yeah.
And enjoy the rest of your weekend. What can I say?
Thank you, sir. And same to you. We're on the first stage of an enormous adventure, and let's enjoy it.
Looking forward to hearing the first episode coming up with Erin from City of Calgary. That's going to come out very shortly after this podcast, this pilot, and listeners will get an idea of what's to come. All the best.
Perfect. Terrific. Onwards and upwards.
We hope you've enjoyed this episode of the CitiesR4Living podcast of the IPMA, the International Project Management Association. Please feel free to send us feedback, your thoughts on the content we provided, and if you'd like to get involved via sur@ipma.world. The SUR standing for Smarter Urban Rural, one of the task teams that's alluded to in one of our pilot episodes. So sur@ipma.world. We'd love to hear your feedback, and please get in contact. Tell us what you think.